Middle-earth, a realm where the ancient songs of creation echo through the lands and the very earth hums with the weight of forgotten history, is a place not easily understood. It is a world alive with mysteries both profound and dangerous, and the deeper one delves into its past, the more the shadows seem to stir. From the mighty kingdoms that once stood proud and strong to the smallest, seemingly insignificant stones scattered across the land, Middle-earth holds secrets. Among these secrets, perhaps none are as perplexing, as haunting, or as powerful as the Palantír, the seeing stones created by the elves. These stones, forged in the light of the valor, were once seen as tools of great wisdom, designed to help rulers see beyond the limits of their lands and gain insight into matters far off. But as with all things of great power, the Palantír became more than just tools for guidance. Their influence grew darker, more insidious, as they began to bind their users to unseen forces. Over time, these stones came to symbolize not wisdom, but corruption, a powerful force that manipulated the wise and bent their will to a darker purpose. At first, the stones were gifts, a symbol of the elves' desire to share their wisdom with the free peoples of Middle-earth. Yet in the wrong hands, their power corrupted. What was once meant for enlightenment became a curse. And within these stones, within their very essence, there was something far darker than anyone could have imagined. A lingering corruption tied to the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, and his malevolent presence that still haunted the world. This story unfolds against that backdrop, the tale of the Palantír's transformation from instruments of guidance to vessels of manipulation. The journey begins in the past, but it stretches its tendrils into the present, revealing a power that continues to shape Middle-earth. What was hidden in the Palantír, and why did the wise fear their influence? Why did they dare not use them? And what, in the end, was it that lay within these stones, waiting to be discovered? As we take this journey, we will uncover a tale of power, betrayal, and darkness, the first seeds of corruption sown long ago, whose consequences would ripple throughout Middle-earth for centuries to come. Our story begins long before the Dark Lord Sauron took his place as the embodiment of evil. The Palantír were not always seen as symbols of corruption. In the First and Second Ages, these stones were revered, considered one of the greatest gifts of the elves to the free peoples of Middle-earth. These stones, created by the elven craftsmen, were meant to be instruments of knowledge. They were tools to help rulers, wise kings, and queens to see beyond their borders and to understand the ebb and flow of the world around them. In their creation, the elves had imbued them with power, an ancient and deep magic that allowed one to look across vast distances, to peer into the hearts and minds of others, and to glimpse the future. The stones were to guide the wise, to help them govern justly, and to ensure that the kingdoms of Middle-earth would prosper in peace. They were gifted to the kings of men and the rulers of the elves with the hope that they would bring wisdom, foresight, and unity. But even as these stones were given to the rulers, a shadow began to creep in. For in the hands of the proud and the powerful, the stones began to lose their purpose. Kings, driven by their own desires for power, began to use the Palantír not as tools of wisdom, but as weapons of control. The stones, originally designed to help guide and enlighten, became vessels for fear, ambition, and manipulation. Gandalf, the wizard of great wisdom, had always known that the Palantír were not to be trusted. He had heard whispers of their dangers for many years, but it wasn't until his deep investigation into the past of these stones that he truly began to understand their dark power. Gandalf, wise in the ways of the world but also cautious, sought to uncover the truth behind these stones and the sinister force that had twisted their purpose. He knew that the stones had been used by the great kings of Númenor, by Saruman, and later by Sauron himself. But the deeper Gandalf looked, the more troubling the truth became. As Gandalf consulted the ancient texts, ancient scrolls written by Elrond and Galadriel, he began to piece together the tale of the Palantír's true history. He uncovered stories of the first time the stones had been used, not for wisdom, but for control. It was then that he realized that the Palantír were never just tools. They had always been vessels of power, dangerous and unpredictable, containing within them a darkness that had been bound by the elves but never fully eradicated. The stones were tied to Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, whose influence never truly left the world. It was Morgoth's twisted vision that had first seeded the idea of controlling the minds of rulers, bending their will with the power of the Palantír. The stones had been used by Morgoth to manipulate those who sought to use them, drawing them into the darkness, shaping their desires and ambitions. Gandalf was disturbed by what he uncovered, for he knew that if the stones had once been tainted by Morgoth's power, they could never be used again in the same way. But even as he pieced together these truths, Gandalf could not shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The power of the Palantír had been too great, too corrupting, and their true nature had been hidden for far too long. The more Gandalf learned, the more he feared the implications of what the Palantír had become. The stones had been used by the kings of Numenor, who had fallen into corruption under the influence of the stones. Sauron, in his guise as an advisor to the Númenórean king, had used the stones to manipulate their decisions, guiding them down a path that led to their destruction. And even in the present, Gandalf could see the legacy of the Palantír's power still lingering, influencing the rulers of Gondor, and perhaps even the hearts of men who had long since forgotten the true danger of these ancient stones. As Gandalf sought to unravel the mystery, he turned to old allies Elrond and Galadriel, both of whom had lived through the ages and understood the weight of the Palantír's legacy. They spoke of the first time the stones were used, and how they had become instruments of fear, binding those who sought to use them in ways they could not have foreseen. They told Gandalf of the ancient betrayal that had taken place, a betrayal not just of the valor but of the very balance of the world itself. Gandalf realized that the Palantír had become more than mere objects. They were symbols of the corruption that had plagued Middle-earth for ages. They were a dark power that could not be undone, and they held the key to understanding the deepest shadows of the past. It was a power that had been hidden from the wise, a power that the elves had once tried to contain, but which had only grown stronger over time. As the investigation deepens, Gandalf knows that he has only scratched the surface of the Palantír's true nature. The journey to uncover their secrets is far from over, but the questions he faces are becoming clearer. What was it that the wise feared so deeply? What did the Palantír hide, and why was it kept from the world? As Gandalf continues to search for the truth, he is drawn deeper into a mystery that spans across ages, a mystery that could reshape the very fate of Middle-earth. As Gandalf dug deeper into the history of the Palantír, the weight of their past grew heavier with each passing moment. What began as an investigation into the stones, origins turned into an unraveling of ancient, hidden truths that had been buried, hidden from the world by those who feared them most. He had uncovered fragments of the story before, pieces scattered in the lore of the elves and the histories of Numenor, but now the full picture was beginning to take shape. The Palantír, forged by the elves, were meant to be tools of wisdom and insight. They were to help the rulers of Middle-earth, both men and elves, see far beyond their borders, to understand the patterns of the world and guide their decisions with foresight. When the stones were first given to the kings of Numenor, they were seen as a gift, a symbol of trust, a promise that those who ruled the world would be wise, fair, and just. But as the years wore on, the true nature of the Palantír began to reveal itself, not as instruments of pure wisdom, but as objects capable of far more. The stones, meant to open minds, began to close them. The desire for power, for control over the future, began to take root in those who gazed into their depths. What was once an instrument of guidance became a tool of manipulation, and in the hands of Sauron, the corruption grew. Gandalf's investigations led him to Numenor, the great island kingdom of men, a realm that had once stood as the epitome of wisdom and strength. The Númenóreans had been gifted the Palantír, but instead of using them to guide their rule, they had allowed them to show them only the paths that they wanted to see. The stones revealed to the Númenórean kings not just the future, but their darkest desires. They became obsessed with the visions of immortality and ultimate power that the stones showed them, their minds twisted by the allure of godhood. Sauron, who had already begun to worm his way into the Númenórean court, seized upon their fear and ambition. He knew exactly how to use the Palantír, how to show them visions of what they craved most. The stones, meant to be symbols of wisdom, became symbols of their downfall. And as the Númenórean kings' greed for power grew, they turned their backs on the very forces that had once guided them, the valor, and began to march towards their own destruction. Through the Palantír, Sauron manipulated the Númenorian kings into defying the valor and seeking immortality. Their hunger for control grew, and the Palantír fed that hunger, showing them only what they wanted to see, slowly pulling them further into darkness. The power of the stones, twisted by Sauron's influence, had turned the once great Númenorian kings into pawns of evil, blind to the destruction they were bringing upon themselves. Gandalf, troubled by these revelations, could feel the weight of the past growing heavier with each new piece of knowledge. The more he learned, the more he understood that the Palantír were not just tools, they were weapons. Weapons that had been used for millennia to manipulate and control, to bend the rulers of Middle-earth to the will of the dark powers. The stones had become far more than a means of seeing the future. They had become instruments of domination. But the danger did not end with the Númenorians. No, Gandalf began to suspect that the Palantír's influence stretched far beyond the fall of Númenor. He could feel an ancient presence stirring in the dark corners of the world. The shadow of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, seemed to linger over the stones, its malevolent touch still present in their very creation. What had begun as a tool of insight and foresight had become something far darker, something that carried within it the legacy of Morgoth's corruption. The Palantír were more than mere stones, they were vessels of a deeper, more ancient evil. Morgoth's influence had never truly left Middle-earth. It had simply waited, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The Palantír were that moment. As Gandalf began to understand the full scope of the power contained within these stones, he began to feel the weight of their curse pressing down upon him. The Palantír had always been part of a much larger design, a design that stretched back to the very beginning of time, to the creation of the world itself. They were not just objects of power. They were instruments of control forged by Morgoth to dominate the free peoples of Middle-earth. The realization hit Gandalf like a blow. The Palantír, in their purest form, had been meant to bring wisdom and insight. But in the hands of Morgoth and later Sauron, they had become something far darker. The stones had become instruments of manipulation, bending the minds of the wise, twisting their desires, and leading them toward their own destruction. And now Gandalf understood the true cost of this knowledge. The Palantír were not just dangerous, they were the very tools that had shaped the history of Middle-earth in ways that no one had truly understood. Gandalf was no longer certain what he had uncovered was just history, it felt more like a warning. The past, it seemed, was not dead. It was alive, living in the Palantír, still capable of shaping the future. The stones had a mind of their own, and they were not merely relics of a bygone age. No, the darkness that had shaped them was still present, waiting to influence those who dared to seek their power. With this knowledge, Gandalf knew that his investigation was far from over. The mystery of the Palantír was much deeper than he had first imagined. What he had uncovered so far was only the beginning of a much larger story, a story that was still unfolding, even now. The stones were not just dangerous because of what they could show, but because of what they could become. And if Gandalf did not tread carefully, if he did not fully understand the true nature of the Palantír, he could find himself ensnared in their dark power, just as those who came before him had been. The world of Middle-earth, it seemed, was not only shaped by the choices of its people, but by the darker forces that lay in wait, forces that had been hidden for ages, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And the Palantír were at the heart of it all. The journey to uncover the true history of the Palantír had only just begun. What Gandalf had learned was only the beginning of a much deeper mystery, a mystery that threatened not only the future of Middle-earth, but the very soul of its people. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, but so was the danger. The weight of the truth lay heavily upon Gandalf. The revelation in Moria, the dark truth of the Palantír's origins and the shadow of Morgoth that had tainted them, was more than the wizard had anticipated. He had known, of course, that the Palantír were powerful, but he had not expected to unearth such a malevolent history tied to the first Dark Lord. What he had learned in the depths of Moria was far more dangerous than any simple tool of foresight. The stones had been twisted by Morgoth's influence, creating a legacy of corruption that stretched far beyond their intended use. And yet, As the Fellowship left the dark halls of Moria behind, the atmosphere around them had changed. Though the stone was left where it had been found, its influence lingered, pressing against them like a weight in the air, invisible but ever present. Each of them, whether they knew it or not, was affected by the revelations that had come to light. They had glimpsed something far darker than they had expected. It was a truth too great to ignore, too great to leave behind. It would forever alter the way they saw the world and themselves. The Fellowship, despite their bravery, was not immune to the consequences of the knowledge they had uncovered. Gandalf, in particular, struggled with the knowledge that the path they were on, the path to defeating Sauron, was fraught with dangers far more insidious than they had anticipated. The Palantír, though left behind, had not been fully eradicated. The darkness they had unleashed had taken root, and the shadows of the past were now stirring once more. As the Fellowship moved forward, there was a rising tension that clung to them like the very air around Moria. They walked the same roads, but something had changed in the way they moved, in the way they looked at each other. Gandalf knew that this weight, this knowledge, was not something that could be cast aside. It would remain with them, shaping their decisions, their trust in each other, and their perceptions of the world. The Palantír had already done their damage, and their influence was far from gone. Gandalf's mind, clouded by the images and knowledge that had flooded him, wrestled with the cost of such wisdom. What had they truly uncovered? What had been unleashed? The danger of the Palantír was far greater than they had realized. It was not just a tool, it was a key to something darker, far older than even Sauron's grasp could reach. The corrupting influence of Morgoth was still present in Middle-earth, and it had shaped much of the history they now sought to understand. The legacy of that evil still twisted the hearts of rulers, whispered in the minds of kings, and still waited, biding its time. As Gandalf grappled with these thoughts, his heart grew heavy. It was not just the danger that the Palantír posed in the hands of the unwise. It was the very knowledge that the stones had shaped the history of Middle-earth in ways that were beyond comprehension. The Fellowship now stood at a crossroads. The choices they made and the knowledge they held could either set them on a path to victory or doom them to repeat the mistakes of the past. Every step they took now had consequences, not just for them, but for all of Middle-earth. Tensions, unspoken but palpable, simmered within the Fellowship. Aragorn, Frodo, and the others may not fully understand the depths of Gandalf's discovery, but they too felt the shift. They felt it in their bones, something had changed, and it was not just the evil they had seen in Moria. It was something deeper, something far older that had always been present, hidden from view. In the quiet, still moments when the Fellowship rested, Gandalf reflected on the deeper cost of the knowledge he had uncovered. Was it worth it? To see the truth, to understand the Palantír's true nature? The answer was not as simple as victory over Sauron. Gandalf realized that the more they understood, the more they risked losing themselves to the very darkness they sought to defeat. The Palantír had corrupted Númenor, had twisted the minds of the wise, and the shadow of Morgoth still loomed large. What had Gandalf uncovered, really? Was it the truth, or just another part of the web of manipulation that had already woven itself into the fabric of their world? The very stones that were meant to bring wisdom had brought ruin instead. And now the Fellowship was walking in the shadow of those same stones, unaware of how much they had already been touched by their influence. As Gandalf's thoughts turned to the future, he saw how the corruption of the Palantír had spread beyond Númenor. The rise of Sauron was tied to these stones, but so too was the corruption of Saruman. The wizard's fall to darkness was no accident. It was the result of the same dark influence that had once pervaded Númenor. The same whispers, the same manipulations still lingered in the air. Gandalf's knowledge of the Palantír and of Sauron's ancient betrayal had given him a clearer view of the web that had been spun over Middle-earth. But it was not just the past that haunted him. The future was just as troubling. Gandalf knew that the Palantír had not been destroyed. They still existed in the world, hidden, waiting to be found again. They were not simply relics of a forgotten age, they were weapons of power, capable of bending the minds of even the wisest of rulers. Sauron, ever the manipulator, would surely seek them out. It was only a matter of time before their influence began to seep into the hearts of those who would be foolish enough to use them. As Gandalf watched the Fellowship move forward, he knew that the path ahead was treacherous. The shadows of the past, those ancient forces of evil, still held sway over the hearts and minds of the free peoples of Middle-earth. And though they had discovered much, there was still so much more to uncover. The Palantir's power was far from spent. It was merely dormant, waiting to rise again. Gandalf's thoughts turned to the coming war, to the looming shadow of Sauron. He understood now that the struggle against the Dark Lord was not just about defeating Sauron, it was about resisting the power that the Palantir embodied. The free peoples of Middle-earth would need to face not just the armies of darkness, but the very stones that had helped shape the fate of the world. The stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. The Fellowship, though united in purpose, was now burdened by a knowledge that none of them had sought. Their path was no longer one of simple victory. It was a battle for the very soul of Middle-earth. And as Gandalf watched them, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had uncovered, he knew that the journey ahead would demand more than they could ever have anticipated. The knowledge of the Palantir, the shadows of the past, and the legacy of Morgoth's influence would forever shape the Fellowship's destiny. The stakes had grown higher. There was no turning back now. The darkness that had once been hidden was no longer a mere threat. It was a part of them, a part of the very world they sought to save. And only through vigilance, wisdom, and courage could they hope to see the light triumph over the shadows.